What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Insurrection Inc. podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show.
All right. Are we recording? And we are we are recording. Welcome to Insurrection Inc. We got a smaller crew tonight. It's just Stratty, Porter, and me. And we got a very special topic. We're talking about one of Stratty's true heroes, who he holds just about in as high regard as Ron Paul, founder of the Mises Institute, probably one of the most important people in the Liberty Movement. Would you like to say his name, Stratty?
That is Mr. Llewellyn H. Rockwell.
Or as people know him, Lew Rockwell. No one says that full name. It's Welsh. Anyway, how's everybody doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm coming at y'all loud and clear with a new microphone. I finally, after so many months, Jay pestered me for so long. I finally got one.
So many tweets directed at you.
You said he was going to flex too.
Oh, but, yeah. He had to. But I can flex harder.
Brag a little bit.
Because I have a new microphone and a new audio interface. So I am better than Porter still, as I am in everything.
Well, sounds
except
like shit
running
your
abilities.
Wi-Fi is bad.
Yeah, well, your Wi-Fi is bad too. You've been cutting out, asshole.
Have I?
I've been having a good time. I don't have anything new to brag about on the podcast. I have a new podcast.
Yeah, but nobody cares about that.
This one.
Nobody cares.
No, we're not talking about that.
Go to the Law of Liberty. Cut that. But I'm just messing around.
I've never listened to an episode of it, and I'm not going to out of solidarity.
Oh, okay. But yeah. So I wanted to talk about Lew Rockwell because I'm a nerd like the rest of y'all. So I'm always trying to find new things about the people we like, and I noticed there's not a lot of discussion about Lew Rockwell within libertarian circles itself. Really, all the discussion you'll find about Lew Rockwell is a bunch of leftists or dumb liberals, neoliberals, not the good kind of liberals that Lew likes. They're just bitching about him, saying that he's a bunch of things that he's not. So I kind of wanted to do this episode to talk about him, not in a history of Lew Rockwell or anything like that, but rather talk about why I think he should be pushed more on certain people within the Liberty Movement, or certain people that we can attract to the Liberty Movement. And I would call those people laymen, and I would consider myself one of them because, I'm a smart person, but I struggle to understand the big academic words and complex concepts when they're first introduced to me are a little hard to catch on to unless they're broken down. Basically. So when I was getting into the Liberty Movement, I really always enjoyed free market economics, but I couldn't ever call myself Chicago or Austrian for the longest time because I had the hardest time understanding all these nuances between Austrian economics and Chicago school. And the reason for that was it was just hard for me to read people like Mises, Hoppe. And I never really cared to try and read people like Milton Friedman because he never, as cool as he can be at times, he was never too appealing to me. So I got really into Lew Rockwell, as y'all know, when I read Against the State, and that's what kind of got me into the ideology of anarchism, specifically anarcho-capitalism. But it wasn't until I read like The Left, the Right, and the State by Lew Rockwell that I truly understood Austrian economics, was able to start arguing Austrian economics, start reading more advanced, nuanced, convoluted type text about Austrian economics. It wasn't until I read that book that I was able to, immerse myself in that. So what I've, have been thinking about lately is, there's a lot of great people that might agree with these concepts, agree with these ideas that we're trying to promote and push out there, ideas that would make society more efficient and better. But I think the reason they never really come to us or come to our side at all is because it's hard for a lot of people to understand these things. And when the most prominent people that are pushed, like Mises or Hoppe, when they're pushed and they're hard to, anyways, when those kind of people are pushed and their texts are really hard to read, because, as I said, they write with very convoluted language. It's hard for basic laymen like myself to catch on. So, what I was thinking was, really, Lew Rockwell, he should be pushed more, just for that fact alone that, when I read that book, obviously I was able to understand the economics, the Austrian school better, and I was able to say, yes, this is what I adhere to. I was able to argue it, but also that book, it taught me so much more. Like, there's these great bits of history that you learn, and you start to, I mean, at that time I already knew, but I can see other people when they read it, light bulbs going off in their head every single chapter, and each chapter is only like 3 or 4 pages long. But each chapter, there's something to be learned from that book. And that's not just with that book alone.
This is left, right, in the state. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's
okay.
It's 434 pages, something like, I don't know how many articles. It's a lot. But he breaks down everything. He explains Marxism, he explains neoconservatism, he explains all these government scandals that have taken place since he's been around, or ones that happened in the past before his time, but are still greatly affect us today, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
But he talked about that a lot, and that's where I learned about that, was from that book. Or like, he talks a lot about court packing, and I learned about that from that book when FDR tried court packing. So I did not know much that I know now until I read this book. Like, so much of what I know now and enjoy talking about and learning more about, literally, I got it from that book. So what I want to ask y'all before I talk about him anymore, talk about any specifics of the left, the right, and the state, or any of his other works and how I think they're good for, giving to people to learn who, need a basic understanding of things. Is there anyone else that y'all think of that are good for laymen like myself or others to immerse themselves in and learn a lot about these topics that we, obviously conversate a lot about? Is there anyone else that you think should be pushed more?
Tom Woods.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I see Tom Woods as the heir to Lew Rockwell.
I can see that totally, because Tom Woods, he puts out stuff just as much as Lew does. I mean, both are Porter, we saw him at Mises. All day they were on their laptops typing up something or arranging something, or like I would walk over to Lew and just ask him how his day was going, and he every single time without fail, he's on the front page of LewRockwell.com curating it for tomorrow morning's headlining articles on there. So yeah, I agree with that one. Jay?
Bob Murphy is also a really good one in the same vein as Tom Woods. I haven't read him personally, but I've heard a lot of good things about his book Choice and how good that is for people who are just getting into it. And as weird as it is, like with the tirade you went on, I still think Rothbard is a really good way for people to get in, because his topics, maybe for a layman that's a little bit more learned on economics, like pay attention to their high school economics class. But the way Rothbard writes still is not very heavy on the terminology like someone like Mises. Rothbard very much took Mises' ideas and condensed them into a way that is easier for the layman to understand. So I still think
we've said this before, but Rothbard was really the first Austrian to write explicitly with the layman in mind. Now, things like Man, Economy, and State were still written to be scholarly works, of course, but they're more accessible than something like Human Action. So.
Yeah, but if you were to give somebody What Has Government Done to Our Money or Anatomy of the State, then those are really easy ways to get someone into the Austrian way of thinking, and then they can build up from there. So, if we were to recommend beginners, definitely all of these Choice, Tom Woods books, Lew Rockwell's books, What Has Government Done to Our Money, those would all be really good things to give to a beginner.
Yeah, and I agree with Rothbard, and I've always had him in mind. I guess I'm just trying to speak more contemporarily and think more contemporarily, which I did say Mises, so bad on me, but oh well. So before we go on back to Lew Rockwell, though, I also want to mention, like, I think Pete Quinones, his podcast is pretty good because
that's a good point.
Yeah, he I think is really good. I think podcasts are actually maybe even better because not everyone,
not us, but other people.
Yeah, for other people, not people like us, but for other people,
real podcasts.
Some people they just don't have the time to focus or sit down and read a book, or some people it's just hard to have the patience to read a book. So for some people, I think podcasting is better. So I put Pete Quinones up there. I put Dave Smith up there. Tom Woods, like we mentioned. I think Buck Johnson from Deaf to Tyrants, the way he interviews people, and it's people like Paul Gottfried. He's had Lew Rockwell on. But the way he interviews them, again, it's a way where anyone can just listen to the interview and be like, oh, okay, I like these ideas. I like what this guy's talking about. This guy seems really cool. I'll look more into these kind of things. So I think all of those podcasts that we mentioned and all those authors that we mentioned are very good for giving to basic people to say, hey, here's someone you can learn about these ideas from.
Well, actually, I will contest the point about Pete Quinones, because it's not a discredit to his show. I love his show, and Porter can tell you like how much it's gotten me thinking a lot lately. He and I,
Jay and I have been talking a lot about his episodes lately.
Yeah, especially lately, he's been getting on these killer guests. But I don't think Free Man Beyond the Wall lately is a good place to enter a beginner, because it is lately a lot of higher level sort of ideas, even if it's not high level, but they're higher level than what a beginner just can handle. So I would start them off generally with Tom Woods and Part of the Problem, maybe Contra Krugman, although that's been canceled now, but still a lot of backlog there. And then maybe curate some early episodes of Free Man Beyond the Wall.
Yeah.
But right now, like, he had Curtis Yarvin on, he had an episode about nihilism and Nietzsche and all that. So I would.
And admittedly, I haven't listened to Free Man Beyond the Wall in a while. I don't listen to podcasts much. I've talked about that before. Kind of when we started this podcast, I stopped listening to podcasts.
Yeah, I've minimized it down to like 3 or 4 shows, and Free Man Beyond the Wall is still the one I consistently listen to.
Yeah. But back to the subject at hand, unless, Porter, you got something else?
Oh, no, I think y'all covered the bases.
No, actually, I do have one thing before you continue.
Go ahead.
And we are not giving ourselves enough credit. Walter Block said we're just as good as the Tom Woods show. So, you know what?
That is true.
Our show should be in the echelons of beginner level podcasts.
And we've had people message us and say, like, oh, it's really actually interesting listening to y'all. And I've had one of my friends texted me and was like, oh yeah, I could definitely get down with the idea of anarchism a lot more after Porter.
Oh, it's usually after the episodes Porter and I do on our own that we get the most feedback.
Porter
true, yeah.
Jokingly asked a question about roads to Walter Block.
I asked Walter Block who would build the roads.
Yeah, and when my friend heard that, he was like, "Oh yeah, his answer made sense. Like I could get down with the idea of anarchism a lot more now." And I was like, "Really?"
I did not expect to convince anybody to become an anarchist based on that one joke question. But
same here. That was funny. So yeah, we can give ourselves a little credit.
Yeah, a little pat on the back.
Yeah, wait, Stratty, did we tell the Tom Woods story from Mises U already?
I think Stratty is frozen.
Stratty is being cryo-frozen right now. I don't think we've told it on the show.
No, we have not. We haven't really done an after hours of smoke break since. Yep.
Yeah. We asked. So like Jay mentioned, Block did tell us that we're just as good as the Tom Woods show when we interviewed him, which was hilarious and probably not true at all. Probably not certainly.
Nah, Walter Block would never lie.
Yeah, you're right. And so at Mises U, Stratty and I walked up to Tom Woods and told him what Walter Block said, and he just kind of laughed and said, "Walter Block's full of shit." He was like, that Walter Block's full of shit. So we're making the libertarian world fight over us right now, which means we're not, like Jay said, we're not giving ourselves enough credit.
Yeah, we're desired goods.
We're the belle of the ball, guys. Come on.
Anyways, back to the subject at hand, Lew Rockwell. So, I'll talk specifically first about the left, the right, and the state, and then I'll get into against the state, because I know I've talked about it on here, but have I ever really gotten in depth about it?
No, you only explained as an influence.
Cool. So I'll do both. Let me go get the left, the right, and the state really quick.
Should I get another beer?
Should you?
I should.
Think carefully.
No.
Dude, I gotta find a different spot for when we record during the afternoon, because there's no one in this building right now, but it actually gets kind of busy during the day.
I can't see Stratty now that you opened the blinds.
Yeah, I just opened them because do I need to close one at least?
Yeah, I cannot see your face.
I mean, it doesn't matter. I don't need to see your face. Just
that good?
read the book.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So right now I'm holding the left, the right, and the state in my hands, and I'm just gonna, looking at the pages. Literally every chapter is 4 to 5 pages on average, and I think that's easy for someone to just pick up, digest something really quickly, think about it, and have more thoughts about it. But looking at the chapters, he literally covers everything. So the first part is he talks about the state, and he talks about things like, why politics fail, or how we should actually know our government, what our government actually does. And there's still liberty to be found even in the presence of living underneath the state. And my favorite article, he talks about why we should legalize drunk driving. And and he has an interesting article in here actually where he it's a bit longer, I think. But anyways, oh no, it's not long. But he basically takes an anatomy of the state approach, but applies it to just the state of Iraq. And he did this around the time whenever we launched the war in Iraq, of course. And it's really interesting because a lot of these articles come from that time. And right now we think of Lew Rockwell as this, this guy that just bashes leftists on the daily, which he does, and he's great at it. But in this book, he goes after right-wingers a lot. So it's really cool to see that side of him, So anyways, that's, part one, the state. Part two, the left, he breaks it down into more sections. He talks about socialism as it is and the idea and ideology of socialism, how they make people kind of succumb to it through subversive means, through things such as cultural Marxism or the Fabian Society. And then he has this next section, which is on regulation. And I love that section because when I read through this whole section of regulation. It's only 16 pages long. And I read through it in one sitting, of course, because it's easy to read that many pages in one sitting. But when I read through it, it was like fireworks were going off everywhere in my head. And I was like, wait a minute. So you're telling me climate change wouldn't be as bad as it is if we weren't subsidizing corporations through a central bank? So I went from not being able to understand that sentence at all, and my mind would be boggled by it, and I probably would never learn about it just because I'm intimidated by the way it sounds alone. I went from feeling that way to being able to say it and explain it to people in the most basic ways possible just because I read that section. And he talks about all kinds of things: free trade, globalization, culture. And then he gets, civil rights. He starts talking about the right, and he talks about how the right has ultimately been been responsible through history for war, through things such as nationalism in their culture, embracing socialist economics to find conservative ideals, even though that's counterproductive and counterintuitive if you think about it. He talks about 9/11. He has a whole section about 9/11 that will make even the most patriotic person become a 9/11 truther. And then he doesn't just talk about those three topics. He starts talking about the market. And this is probably actually my favorite section of the book, totally. Our favorite part of the book, because like I said before, it's because of this book I'm able to understand Austrian economics. I'm able to argue Austrian economics. I'm able to get more into advanced theory of Austrian economics. So he basically takes economic ideas and then applies them to contemporary things happening in the news. He explains why, he has this whole chapter, and I posted about this today on Instagram, where he breaks down the fast food industry. He talks about, how fast food's basically been a miracle for poor people who didn't have access to cheap food. or really even this abundance of food that came about because of the market. And then he goes on to talk about how in nations where they do try to feed people through government action, the result has actually always been pretty much starvation. Like, look at the socialist nations that we make fun of all the time. They had these wealth distribution programs in place that were supposed to go towards feeding people nutritious meals. And instead, it didn't work at all. The only people that were getting fat under socialism were the elite. Everyone can be fat under capitalism. I mean, shit, look at how obese this nation is. So, like, I would have never been able to understand something like that. Why I always knew why wealth redistribution, I always knew it was a bad thing, but I was able to now argue why it was bad. It doesn't even meet its own goals. And then he talks about things like price signals. And the way he explained that was he's talked about during Hurricane Katrina, whenever, bottles of water were like $70 and how people were like, this is terrible. How could they do such a thing? And he goes on to explain, like, yeah, it sucks, but that's kind of what we need to do if we don't want to lose supplies so quickly and have shortages. We need to adhere to price signals so we can understand when something is really, really, really in demand and we should probably find a substitute for it, or when something isn't in demand and we can buy in bulk and save up on it for the future. And so, like, basic ideas like that I won't even call them basic, because let's face it, that is something hard for the common man to understand.
I just want to take a quick break to announce that we have a Patreon now, where you can support us with money for some reason. That is patreon.com/insurrectioninc. And if you don't want to support us with fiat, you can go to float.app/insurrectioninc. That is FLOTE.app, and give us cryptocurrency. And if you don't want to give us money monthly, because why would you? You can go on down to our merch shop and pick something you like. Links will be in the description, and don't forget to join our Discord. Now back to the show.
But I would have never understood ideas like that if it wasn't for someone like Lew Rockwell breaking it down and putting it into context that someone who at least keeps up with what's going on in the world can understand. And I really do appreciate that, because I think he was looking at it and was able to notice that, there are a lot of people out there who do want to know more. The problem is they have trouble learning more because of how hard learning can be sometimes. So for that reason alone, I would recommend this book to everyone. But the last part of this book, and then I'll talk about Against the State. Last part of this book I think is great too, because it's not really informal, but rather it's inspirational, because it's called What to Do. And he talks about, like, these are the steps we need to take if we want to secure liberty. And the last one he has in there, it's a article called "We Need an Angel Like Clarence." That article is really great to me, because he just talks about the movie It's a Wonderful Life and the character Clarence in it, and how great that character is. And he's saying we need that in our movement. We need to show people, like, liberty is just not something you give up on. Liberty is just not something you quit. It's something you use it. And I loved that, because it gives me a lot of optimism, and I imagine it could give a lot of people a lot of optimism. So that's The Left, the Right, and the State. It's, like I said, 434 pages long. I believe you can find a free PDF of it on Mises.org. And also, all of these are articles that I believe you can find on LewRockwell.com. Some of them probably not. They might be from old newsletters, like the Rothbard-Rockwell report, that are no longer in print and are hard to find PDFs of. So that's that book. Great book. I really recommend that to not people who are already into this kind of thing, but to people who aren't into this kind of thing and want to be in it, or to anyone who's trying to get their friends who, won't understand the intricate stuff. Give this to them and tell them to read it, and I promise you they'll be hooked. So that's for a basic general understanding of libertarianism, the libertarian ideology as a whole, in my opinion. Now, Against the State, and I've talked about on here how great of an influence this book has been on my thinking. But let's take a look at what the book actually has. So the book is Against the State, and it's Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto, and that's truly what it is. Because his forward, the introduction is, he says why I am an anarcho-capitalist, and he lays it out for you. He doesn't say I think or I think it could be. He says it is. It's the only consistent ideology, both through economics and politically wise. He doesn't use that word, but he just talks about it, and then he basically ends it by saying
he just made up that word. So.
Yeah, but he goes on to say basically at the end of it, like, so now let me tell you why it is what it is, and it's already got you hooked. You're like, okay, all right, teach me. like this sounds badass. So the first chapter, it's about the war system as a whole, and he crushes it. He breaks it down about how it's, it only favors the elite. Those are the only people who benefit off of it. The rich send the poor off to go die, and that's not a fault of capitalism, but rather a fault of corporatism and central banks. And like, he broke it down in such a way of like, I would have never even considered these kind of thoughts had I read this book. And now that the thoughts crept into my mind, it's all I can think about. It's all I can talk about. Next chapter is the war on drugs. Again, I've always thought like, all drugs should be legal, but I never understood how the war on drugs was totally immoral until I read this chapter. And wow, it targets minorities. It benefits the elite while the poor suffer from it. It packs the prisons up, and the prisons, they want them to be packed because they make more money when the prisons are packed. The state does. So, and then the next one is the assault on our liberties. He goes through all kinds of legislation and such that attack the liberty that belongs to us, that we have. The bankers' war on America, the Fed. Man, as you all know on here, I hate the Federal Reserve. That's probably the thing I talk about the most. I kind of got into it just because I liked Ron Paul. I just kind of echoed it because I liked Ron Paul. Reading Ron Paul is a little hard because he's a bit too basic and a bit too boring when he writes. Lew Rockwell, though, whoo, man, he made me passionately hate the Fed. And that's something obviously you guys know I have not been able to shut up about since y'all have met me.
None of us can, so don't pride yourself.
That's something great about it. Next chapter, actually, this might be my favorite chapter, is American Fascism. Ever since I've read this book, believe that America is a fascist country because of how they conduct matters economically and politically, and also how they introduce legislation. I would have never, again, understood that idea, considered that idea, or talked about that idea had I not read it. And then this chapter, I know you guys are going to love, because this is something that, classical liberals, minarchists bring up to us all the time and try to make an argument for. Why not limited government? He basically breaks down that, checks and balances can never exist. Who's going to be checking on this guy? Who's going to make sure his balance is powered out? Okay, what about the guy that's doing that job? It's just a never-ending Pandora's box that's opened up whenever government exists itself. And then how would anarchy work? That's the last chapter. And that one made me realize anarchy's the way. That's what we got to embrace. Politics isn't working out for us. Elections aren't working out for us. Sure, it's cool to use it as a tool to a minimum degree just to bring people onto these ideas, but you got to ditch it at some point. You can't just keep holding on to it, because, as much as we love Ron Paul, he's a hero, done great. We can never speak bad about that man, but he didn't get too much done in Congress. He was just there spreading the message, as he says. And that, God bless him for that. But we need people on every front, and not every person is going to be qualified enough to run for Congress or get a seat in Congress. So we need just people to realize, let's get direct action. Like you say, Jay, let's start embracing a direct action. Let's practice direct action, or let's practice counter economics. Let's stop buying from these places that, you know, the state benefits from when we buy, and let's just go to mom and pop shop. Let's shop local. Let's empower the real free markets that exist. Those are ideas I espouse and love to talk about today, and pretty much have am going to dedicate my life to spreading, and it's all because of these two books.
I would like to take a second and say that Stratty has just endorsed me over Porter as the official agorist of the show.
No,
Even though Porter has been the agorist for longer.
Okay, you've read more Konkin, so
I have read more Konkin.
No,
I'm a better agorist than Porter because I also own cryptocurrency. So.
I will deny that. You are doing more practice than I am. Like, that's okay.
Mm-hmm. My practice
I'm
is
still
better.
not 100% convinced on cryptocurrency.
My practice is better.
Going back and forth on the economics of it.
Porter has read Pear Byland, though, and not many of us can say that because his books are expensive. So
his books are expensive as shit.
That's true.
But anyways,
let me interject just because Jay brought that up. I'm sorry, Stratty, I have to do this.
He has to flex. He has to flex real quick.
Oh yeah. This is cool.
So that article, when we interviewed Sal said the most underrated piece of agorist literature is a short article on LewRockwell.com, as a matter of fact, called "A Strategy for Pushing Back Against the State" by Per Byland, and he actually wrote his book, "The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized," which I've read. With that article in mind. It was like an expansion of that article, basically, an expansion into the economic theory of it, really, not just the strategy. And so that should be considered a major piece of agorist literature, I think. And Jay hasn't read it, so
I agree with Porter.
I got that one.
We talked about this at Mises U actually, and throughout talking with Porter that whole week at Mises U, I basically told him one night, like, yeah, I totally get it now. I totally see why people think Per Byland is the greatest living economist, and I agree now. Like, I think he is. But
yeah, but let me counter. Let me counterflex one last thing. I don't care how much you've read. I've engaged in more black market activity than you, allegedly. So, eat it.
In Minecraft.
Again, I didn't deny that. I mean,
it's all about praxis. It's all about praxis, Porter. That's the whole point of agorist. Anyway, that's not this episode. So,
wait a minute, isn't that like
I have something in the works though?
Isn't that a leftist saying where they're like, praxis ain't shit, or no, theory ain't shit with no praxis, something like that? I've seen.
That's also a different discussion that's a different discussion for a different episode.
Yeah, we'll talk. That's a yeah.
As it turns out, Rothbard thought we are leftists, but that's a whole
that's another episode.
That's another episode in the planning, so we're going to get to that another day. But anyway, so I do have a question for Stratty, though, like a legitimate one regarding introductory literature, because I've read a lot, even though I was already maybe an anarchist for a year and a half by the time I started reading the anarchist literature. I went through a lot of introductory literature. So I've read, what's it called? It's on the tip of my tongue. Anatomy of the State. I've read the New Libertarian Manifesto. New Libertarian Manifesto, which is really an introductory thing. It's like 30, 40 pages. I've read this Libertarian.
I didn't know it was that short.
It is very short. It's shorter than Anatomy of the State. 60 pages, and Anatomy of the State is 90 pages. But then I've read.
I think New Libertarian Manifesto is actually longer than Anatomy of the State.
No, it's shorter.
They're both.
It's shorter.
It's
shorter.
They're both under 100 pages. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I finished in one sitting in a car ride. No, I downloaded it off the internet because I'm a better agorist than you. So.
Okay.
I read Anatomy of the State in one sitting too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I read Anatomy of the State during Spanish class. All throughout,
it's so short.
I read it during my business statistics class that I'd already done all the work for because it was the actual in-class periods were useless.
And I've also read this one, Libertarian Anarchy Against the State by Gerard Casey, which for me personally, after reading it, I think over Anatomy of the State, over New Libertarian Manifesto, over all the other introductory ones, would be the book that I recommend to people if they're starting out into libertarianism, because it does a really it's not economics heavy at all. It's a very theory heavy book, so it skips the economics and it goes into explaining the history of the state. It's got a lot of history in it that I think even learned libertarians and anarchists can learn a lot from. It has what is libertarianism, it has what is anarchism, why you should be an anarchist, historical examples of it. And I think it is the best takedown I've read personally. I haven't read Rockwell, so I can't comment, but I think this one would be my go-to. So why over something like this or Anatomy of the State would you recommend, aside from reading out the chapter titles, what is it that really captivated you the most over other things that are created really for the entry-level layman?
Okay, so I can't speak for over that book because I haven't read that book, but I want to now because it does sound interesting.
It's really good. I recommend it.
As for why I would put Against the State, I wouldn't put Against the State over Anatomy of the State, but I also wouldn't put Anatomy of the State over Against the State because I think Against the State, because I read Anatomy of the State before I read Against the State. Anatomy of the State did not sell me on the idea of being an anarchist, but it definitely had me thinking, oh, I'm a little more sympathetic to these ideas and I can consider them, but I don't subscribe to them yet. And Against the State did that for me. It made me subscribe to those ideas, and it made me realize why these ideas are legit, why they are the way to go. Also, this is something I'm kind of happy you asked this now because I wasn't going to bring this up. In Against the State specifically, he does do it a lot in The Left, the Right, and the State. But in Against the State specifically, Lew Rockwell uses language that just makes your blood pump, dude. Like he has this one paragraph where he's talking about cops, and he's just like, these blood-sucking leeches, or these blood-sucking leeches who use our funds to be tyrannical thugs and oppress our liberty, something like that. But it just makes you like, oh yeah, fuck cops. Like that's how you feel reading it. And so I mean that's one reason. Two, yeah, it's great that Anatomy of the State is short, or New Libertarian Manifesto is also short, and they include good little historical anecdotes and such like that. However, they're not necessarily contemporary. Against the State was written in, I think, 2013. So there's like some very contemporary issues it talks about that we still face today and are ongoing, or that we grew up through and happened in our childhood, you know. So he talks about things like that. And also it's a little more expansive than those books. Like, no, this book, Against the State's not economics heavy at all either. And I honestly would not recommend an economics heavy book to someone because I think that will scare them away. I think just showing them the theory and basic ideas of how we should treat people, or how we should conduct ourselves as a society, and is government a good idea or not, and why are the basic ideas against government, and what are the basic ideas for government. I think that's a better way to get people immersed than handing them something economics heavy, because I mean, economics is it's easy to understand once you understand it, but it's scary at first, like in terms of it's a lot to factor in.
Yeah, for me, it was like I got into it immediately through the economics perspective because I was the only person in my AP macro class that actually enjoyed economics, and decided like halfway into the year before we even started it that economics was going to be my major in college, and I've stuck with it since. So, you know, for me personally, that it clicked already with me on a personal level. For other people, I definitely understand that trying to give them something that's practically an economics textbook of libertarian economics isn't going to work well. And I think what you put there, talking about that chapter about the police, is something that would make me consider choosing my audience if I'm recommending a book. Because libertarian anarchy, I love it personally, and I think it's great. But even though it's pointed at the layman, it's pointed at a certain type of layman, the type that you know is already going to be a little more intellectual leaning. So it doesn't use language aside from a few glib remarks here and there to give it a little light. It doesn't have much language that's going to get your blood boiling. Instead, it's going to get your mind thinking in the same way Anatomy of the State does. Even though I just looked up, this was published a year before Against the State. But then if Against the State has that certain language that riles people up, then if you know your audience, that's something that could be really useful, getting somebody riled up to think about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think y'all know me enough to say that, yeah, I'm that kind of person that likes to get riled up about something and start talking and going off about something. But I like that you brought up, how you came to understand economics, because it wasn't that I didn't know what economics was or understand like the very, very, very basic ideas of economics before I read this book. Because I grew up every morning at breakfast. My dad would read the paper and I would watch Sesame Street, but my dad would talk to me while I tried to watch it and just talk about, that's the trade-off, or location, 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 or the broken window fallacy. He goes off about that. My dad's a big bossy talk guy. But
what did you just call him?
Bastiat? It's Bastiat.
Bastiat. All right. But anyways, yeah. My dad really.
Oh my God.
My dad read that guy a lot. My dad read, who was it? Oh, Milton Friedman and Walter Williams a lot. He read both those guys a lot. So he would always talk about those things as I was growing up. But when you're young, you don't care about it. Like, yeah, because it was repeated to me so much, it kind of soaked into my mind. Like, if I heard it, I'm like, oh, yeah, I know what that is. But then it was actually, I guess, reading the book, Left, the Right, and the State, it I guess made me realize why economics matter, why these things matter, why they need to be emphasized, and why they need to be expanded upon, looked into more, just things like that. So I'm glad you brought that up. But so now I want to ask Porter, though. Porter, what do you think is a good introductory, doesn't even have to be book, just introductory type writing for someone to read to get into this kind of stuff?
Well, I don't have any specific recommendations. Like, I think y'all covered the bases there. But something I will say is, like Jay was talking about, you have to find a specific type of writing, and it appeals to certain people. I think that's something important for libertarians to recognize, is that you're never going to convince everybody. There are just some people out there who legitimately believe they have the right to control the people around them and enforce their will on others, no matter what that might be or how ridiculous it might be, or how much it might be against the interests of everyone else, or violates their rights in the Rothbardian sense or whatever. So it is important that you get something that you have to pick your audience, basically pick your battles. And so I'm glad that y'all are recommending books like Against the State and Libertarian Anarchy, because I do think that once you find out who's receptive to your audience, or who's receptive to your message, once you find out that audience, you should take it all the way. These books should be explicitly anarchist, because things like Milton Friedman and Walter Williams, like you said, they were pretty good, like decent classical liberals. Even I hate the term classical liberal, but like pretty good minarchist guys, basically.
They're good if you want to learn more about the other sides of issues, but if you're trying to get someone to get into the ideas and embrace these ideas, they're not.
Yeah, I think you should start off explicitly anarchist. I think there are ways to walk them into that where it doesn't immediately turn them off when you hear the word anarchy, but still is explicitly that from the start, instead of someone who only goes halfway like Milton Friedman, which can still be educational, but it's not the end goal. You start someone off with that, it builds up kind of a barrier in their mind against the consistent view that we believe we have. So I'm glad that people like Lew Rockwell exist, who can write books like that introduce people to these ideas in a consistent way without turning them off immediately. And like I said earlier, like Tom Woods, I think, is the next best example of that. What's the author? Gerard Casey, is that the name, that wrote Libertarian Anarchy? Yeah. I'm glad those guys exist, because I'm not sure I could do that. I come off a little too heated sometimes, but I do think that's the best way to do it, is to be explicitly anarchist from the start.
There's only one minarchist type person that I think I would recommend to anyone for someone to read as a beginner's thing, because I know they would read this person and then become an anarchist, and that's Ron Paul. Like, I know I said he was a boring author earlier. It's not that he's boring. He's just more redundant. But that's also kind of good, because redundancy is good. If you repeat something enough, it will instill in your mind. But The Revolution by Ron Paul, that's the book that made me start appreciating libertarian ideals. Like, I still said stuff like, oh no, we need police, stuff like that. But obviously Ron Paul needs to keep an image to a degree because of what his position is in the liberty movement, whereas someone like Lew Rockwell can just come out and be like, nah, fuck them about the police, and we do need people like that. So Porter, that's a great point you made. I'm very happy you made that one.
Stratty said, let's keep this clean episode, and he has so far cursed more than me, which is astounding.
I know I was the only one that didn't adhere to that. So
no,
good
Porter
on you guys.
Also once or twice.
Oh yeah, Porter did say shit. When was the second time?
I don't know.
Oh, well, did I? I don't even remember.
You did.
Jay's rubbing off on me.
I have had the cleanest tongue this entire episode, and that is awesome. Rare.
Go ahead and get it out of your way right now, because this isn't going on mute.
I'm good.
Okay.
I got nothing to curse about, so.
So, I mean, I think this has been a great episode, though. I can already see it getting a few shares here and there, maybe quite a bit of listeners. Anything y'all want to talk about before we wrap up? Because I've pretty much said what I want to say.
I mean, there were a few interesting things you said earlier in your rant, but I can't really remember them now. So
I did want to talk more about LewRockwell.com. I think that's one of his biggest achievements that goes overlooked. Obviously, his books are great. I think LewRockwell.com might be one of the single most influential things that's ever happened to the liberty movement, because it was one of the original places that a lot of like Rothbard and Mises shorter articles got republished.
Yep.
And then, tons of original articles. Like I mentioned, that Harab Island article that Sal considers one of the most important but underrated works of agorist literature. That was on LewRockwell.com originally. Tons and tons of articles. And a lot of it is kind of the same way, like explicitly anarchist, but walks you into it. And so it's still good for beginners or people who haven't really been introduced to the ideas yet. And it's a consistent platform that is very radical when you really look at it, but doesn't scare people away at the same time. And just the sheer volume of work that's been put out on there is invaluable to the liberty movement.
So before you wrap up, I'll say a few things about LewRockwell.com. That's the one, that and Zero Hedge. Those are the two websites I check every day and look at their front page. However, LewRockwell.com has been around since 1999, and they have a ton of authors on there. Some aren't even listed. You have to look for them. So one of my favorite things to do when I'm really, really, really bored and LewRockwell.com is open on my laptop, go to the search bar and just type in a random word and see what kind of articles pop up on it. It's so fun. And there's always great stuff on the front page of Lew Rockwell. It's a news site, so there's always going to be something current events wise, but there's even philosophical things like David Gordon's on there. So yeah, LewRockwell.com, that's an awesome website. Check that one out, everyone.
I don't know, what about him founding the Mises Institute? Because that's also, he's the founder of the Mises, not Rothbard, not Walter Lew Rockwell, founder of the Mises Institute, of course, with his buddies, Walter Block and Murray Rothbard and all that, but he founded it. So what's the story there? I never even looked into that.
So Lew Rockwell actually started out as Mises's editor in the 70s.
Really?
After he graduated from high school. He got a job at Libertarian Press, and one day someone called him, I think Neil McCaffrey or someone like that, and they called him and just said, how would you like to be Ludwig von Mises's editor?
The way you pronounce things.
Anyways, he showed up, and it was 1970, early 1970s. But he showed up, had lunch with him and his wife, Margaret von Mises, and that was basically it. He shook his hand and he just became his editor. And down the line, he met Murray Rothbard, and Murray Rothbard got him into anarchism. And then he met Ron Paul, and they became very good friends. And he became Ron Paul's chief of staff. And he was working for another institute at the time that was kind of libertarian based, but it wasn't a big one, and it wasn't really having big aims. So he just said one day, he's like, I'm going to go start off my own thing. And they were like, okay. And he got millionaires to start investing in stuff. But here's something crazy. the Koch brothers got they contacted him, and they didn't want him to do this because they didn't like that it was he was taking basically an anarchist take on libertarianism and economics in general and going to the extreme with it.
Well, that and one of the Kochs had founded the Cato Institute with Rothbard.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I was going to get into that. That was a part of because this was during the planning of getting the Mises Institute launched. The Mises Institute didn't launch till 1982. Murray Rothbard left the Cato Institute in 1981. It's because of this. This is part of the reason. There's a lot to it, but that is part of the reason. Okay, so going on though, Lew Rockwell he over the years got a lot of investors and stuff and donors, and started out in, I think, California, and they had their first Mises U's and such in like Southern California and some other places. It got settled in Alabama when John V. Denson, I believe, contacted him and was he's a professor at Auburn, and just said like there's a piece of property here we can, I think, either give to you or sell. They sold to him really cheap. And that's how the Mises Institute came about in Auburn, Alabama. However, you bring up that, like Porter brought up, I wasn't even considering this when we did this episode, but how Porter brought up, LewRockwell.com is probably the most influential libertarian publication out there. And then Jay, you just brought up the Mises Institute. When it comes to anarcho-capitalism, there's no better institute. There's no better, place to go to learn about that in general. Is no better place than the Mises Institute. Lew Rockwell is responsible for both those creations. Lew Rockwell is responsible for popularizing people like Mises, Rothbard, Ron Paul. He was behind the Ron Paul campaigns. I mean, as great as Mises and Rothbard are, no one would be reading them if it wasn't for Lew Rockwell. No one would be reading them. We would not know who those people are if it wasn't for Lew Rockwell. So just like us coming to that conclusion from there, we can say like Lew Rockwell is the godfather of the liberty movement in a sense.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for him, there would be no liberty movement. There would be no Ron Paul. There would be no Murray Rothbard. There would be no Mises Institute. There would be no love for Ludwig von Mises. And
why do you say things?
This is a funny analogy I like to make, but Lew Rockwell is like the Dr. Dre of the liberty movement because of him, the same way of Dr. Dre, we figured out all these great rappers we would have never heard of unless they had Dr. Dre as their producer. We figured out so many great libertarian writers because they had Lew Rockwell in their corner. They had Lew Rockwell to go out there and promote them on such an amazing platform as LewRockwell.com and the Mises Institute. So for that, we have so much to thank him for.
Let me tell you why that's a bad analogy. 2 reasons. Number 1, I only know one rapper that Dr. Dre promoted, and that's Eminem.
Bad analogy for you.
And number two, I've listened to Dr. Dre. I haven't read Lew Rockwell.
Bad analogy for you.
Bad analogy. If it doesn't click with me, it's a bad analogy.
No, there's people that will appreciate that. That do appreciate that.
I've got a better analogy. And this is how good it is that it's going to go right over your head. Lew Rockwell is the Rory Gallagher of the libertarian world. He's done so much.
Is that the guy from Oasis?
No, not at all.
No.
That I think it's Noel Gallagher.
Okay.
And the brothers. But no, Rory Gallagher was an Irish blues guitarist who has an amazing catalog. He revolutionized blues by mixing with traditional Irish scales, and he's underappreciated as hell outside of the small circles. So that is why it's a good analogy for Lew Rockwell.
Okay, I'll accept it. Porter, do you have an analogy before we wrap up?
I do not have an analogy to contribute. I don't think so.
Okay.
Lew Rockwell is the paired violin of the libertarian.
You know what? I got one. one.
Okay.
Shoot, what's his name though? Oh,
that's how good that analogy is.
He's the Roger Bannister of the Liberty Movement. Bannister was the first one to run a 4-minute mile, sub 4-minute mile. And
I like my analogy better.
I didn't say I had a better analogy. I just said I had one.
Running is stupid.
I like yours, Porter.
Thank you, Stratty. Yeah.
So this has been Insurrection Inc. for the week. Thank y'all for tuning in. Do y'all have any plugs?
No, because Connor Report got shut down.
If we ever
I know,
have
I was like,
to,
I don't have any anymore. Cont Report's gone. What do I have to fucking show people?
If we ever have to run off to the woods because the state tries to, I don't know, forcibly vaccinate us or something, then running will come in handy because there are lots of black bears around where I live in the mountains, and they're not particularly aggressive. But the good thing is, if one decides to get aggressive, I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than Jay and Stratty. That's pretty easy.
That's not a plug. And number two, there's these things called guns. How's that a plug?
Yeah, I'll kneecap you first to be sure.
How's that a fucking plug?
It's not,
now Porter just sounds like the guy
We're
that's
doing
like
plugs.
Porter sounds like the guy that's like, I'll bench 415 and whoop your ass, boy.
He's a trained Navy SEAL. He has 300 confirmed kills in Afghanistan.
I know.
He's training guerrilla warfare.
I was supporting your healthy habits until you decided to be a little asshole, so fuck you. Jay, you got any plugs?
Hey, Stratty, I know you could run faster than Jay. I'll give you that much.
Than Jay. I could, I'm
how's that
I'm pretty
You're not getting eaten by the bear.
I'm not a good runner, but I could run faster than Jay.
How's that even in comparison? I was a slow runner already, then I have all my fucking vices. That's like saying I run faster than a cripple.
It'll be a test to see whose lungs give out faster, Jay's or Stratty's.
Jay's. Come on now, Jay's.
Mine were
Mine
were awful from birth. Like I had horrible lungs from birth. I used to have an inhaler in elementary school.
So
I still use an inhaler. I have severe lung problems actually. That I didn't find out about them until like last week. So I just went on the inhaler, but apparently it's pretty bad. I'll tell you all about that off air. But
see, I'm not a pussy, so I can breathe. But anyways, I have one funny story real quick before we end the episode. But whenever we got when we got to Auburn, we went to Jay's Airbnb because he was visiting, of course. It was me, Cotton, and my brother Matt. Jay sat down, was having a cigar, a cigarette, and his vape all at the same time in one sitting. And did not realize it. While also drinking wild turkey.
No, I realized it. I know what I was doing.
Jesus Christ. All right.
I knew we were having cigars. And I was like, well, my cigar's
Jay's
out,
definitely the one getting eaten by the bear.
Yeah.
No, because I have a gun.
Okay, well, you're the one who's going to have to stay behind and shoot. I won't have to worry about that.
Okay. Then we have food. Do you know what hunting is?
Oh, God. Can we wrap this up and argue off air?
Yes, thank you guys for listening.
Yeah, we can.
Leave us a rating. If you're on YouTube for whatever reason, leave a like, subscribe, share the podcast. It helps us grow. We hate you all, but we love you. Have a good day.
Also, by the time this goes out, we may have a merch store up. I'm not sure yet. We're working on that. We're very close to having it finalized. So
not confirmed. We're awful with deadlines. We didn't even get an episode up this week, so whatever. See you guys later.